We're going to have a chat about equality legislation, a really quick chat. So, if you ask people what laws they think protects women's rights, they will tell you. They won't tell you it's safeguarding systems. They won't tell you it's the systems that allow women emancipation from abuse. They won't tell you that it's the systems that allow them to outsource care labour, and for that, the place where they outsource that labour to be regulated and to be safe for their children. They will tell you that the reflection of women's rights in the 20th century is equality legislation. It's not true. So equality legislation has historically been concerned with market participation, some. It has historically created single-axis discrimination categories which deny protection to people where they don't live life within these legal fictions. So Crenshaw's really good. She outlines how a black woman who is being discriminated against because she's a black woman might be denied protection because the discrimination that she's experiencing can't be described as discrimination on the grounds that she's black because it's not aimed at black men, and it can't be described as discrimination on the grounds that she's a woman because it's not aimed at black women, and then she'll be sat in the centre and denied protection. Now, what Crenshaw was really, really good at is she showed how this removal of women's reality and distillation of their reality into kind of atomised identity facets usually is part of the route to the recreation of power relations where women are actually subordinated. So subordinating the reality of their identity, subordinating the reality of who they are, it actually results in the reproduction of power relations. And she wasn't talking about small things. She was talking about the way these systems link together. So not only will you then be denied protection with legislation, but the chances are, like the other systems that are joining around your life, whether they be cash transfer systems or systems where you're dealing with your children, they're going to be reinforcing subordination. And then activism is actually going to reinforce your marginalisation because, well, she was actually really good at showing how power relations reproduce through activism. But actually you can see really clearly through, say, Corbynism and the way that they kind of came up with austerity, the impact of these systems and called it a centrist dads and melts movement, and then eventually came up with an acronym that means any woman discussing these systems deserves to be kind of hit. So that's actually a really good demonstration of what she was talking about. But essentially at its core is the fact that equality legislation is really a top-line recognition that equality is contested, it's generally not got any resources to back it up. It only applies in some spheres, and it's generally more designed to deny people protection than it is to actually offer it to them. Now, the evolution of equality legislation is really, really interesting, and I would urge you to read Mary Daly and Jane Lewis on the work that they've done in following the trajectories of equality legislation and its connection with family and work and other things through the EU, and they've actually followed that for a number of years. Now, for many, many years, following the fact that equality legislation has been toothless, has been a fruitless exercise, because, as we said in the other video, you can't do anything. At the point in time where institutions are just developing normally, you can't really intervene, you have to wait. But we're actually now going through a process where the problem that Mary Daly, Jane Lewis, Kimberly Crenshaw, Nicola Lacey, they all highlight with equality legislation providing an ineffective top line where that people recognise as that, but with no recognition of all these other systems. We've now reached a crisis point because of austerity where these systems have been hit back, where we're actually going to be forced to recognise the way that these systems link together. And one of the things that the TERF acronym and the ridiculousness of the trans ID debate has done is it's highlighted which institutions cannot see all the systems that I'm discussing. It has also shown how violent power relations are reproduced to protect that blindness and the way that women are lashed out at because of it. But it's also going to force, at a point in time where we have to recognise all these systems, a synthesis in our understanding of the fact that actually equality is not just protected by equality legislation, equality is also protected by emancipation from violence and the ability to outsource care labour, and that women's gender roles have actually resulted in massive changes to the economy side that we now need to acknowledge. And unfortunately, I identify as is not enough for us to be able to ignore those changes, because we have to recognise these changes to get out of a multitude of policy crises. So what's happened until now is that even though policymakers and economists have not really been aware of the bottom line of what equality legislation symbolises, they haven't been aware of what systems are actually involved and have been impacted by women's changing gender roles, they're now about to be forced to. Because up until recently, they could afford to be blind by that, because political responsibility could still be taken, because it was institutions like the civil service and local authorities that made sure that policy that came from people who didn't know that was filtered through institutions where they did. And now those institutions are eroded and are in crisis, so we're at a synthesis point right now where we are going to be forced to recognise that equality legislation is basically the top line. It's recognition that equality for women is contested, but it's actually linked to a number of other systems and legal frameworks that policymakers and other institutions do not recognise, and it's actually the interaction of these systems that upholds equality for women. And it's here that trans rights activists have requested a safeguarding debate, and the minute that debate has happened, they've kind of reacted and gone, oh my god, this is hate speech, you're being terrible. No, these are the systems that always existed. Every time you request a safeguarding debate, you immediately become the least important person in that conversation, and these are all the systems that we have to know.